You know that feeling when the hair on the back of your neck stands up? That primal little alarm bell telling you something is wrong before your brain even processes it? That was my Tuesday morning, 6 a.m., coffee in hand, staring at the front door of my house in Pine Creek Estates. It wasn't a knock, it was a hammer blow. The kind of pounding that rattles the frame and makes the dust dance in the morning light. Aggressive, demanding, the sound of bad news arriving early. I'm a big guy, worked construction for 30 years before my back gave out, so I don't spook easy. But when I pulled the door open, I froze because standing on my welcome mat were for men in tactical black. Polarized Oakleys covering their eyes, hands resting heavy on drop-leg holsters. Looking like a hit squad from a budget action movie, step aside. Mr. Miller, the one in front, barked, his voice trying way too hard to sound like gravel and authority. We're taking your wife into custody. Now, my wife, Eleanor. She's the kind of woman who irons her socks and organizes her spice rack alphabetically. Not exactly the type to be on a most wanted list, so I laughed a nervous, confused chuckle that died in my throat when I saw the lead guy unclip the retention strap on his pistol. He wasn't smiling. None of them were. They were posturing, chests puffed out, radiating that specific brand of arrogance you usually see in people who failed the police academy psychological exam but still bought the gear on Amazon. Custody for what? I asked, planting my feet in the doorway, blocking their view inside. And who exactly are you boys supposed to be? I don't see any badges, fugitive recovery and compliance, the guy sneered, tapping a Velcro patch on his vest that looked about as official as a Boy Scout merit badge. Your wife has outstanding warrants for failure to comply with community statutes. Now move, or you're going down for obstruction. The neighborhood was waking up behind them. I could see Mrs. Higgins across the street peering through her blinds, clutching her robe. And down the block, a dog started barking, sensing the tension in the air. It felt surreal, like a nightmare bleeding into the sunrise. Because these guys didn't move right, real cops have a rhythm, a protocol. But these four were jagged, nervous energy disguised as toughness, their fingers twitching too close to their triggers. "Show me the warrant," I said, my voice dropping an octave, trying to buy time. You don't walk into a man's house in this state without paper signed by a judge. We don't need a judge. We have the board's authorization, the second guy piped up, shifting his weight. And that's when it clicked the board, the Homeowners Association, specifically Roger Sterling, the little tyrant who ran our neighborhood like his own personal fiefdom. Roger had been fining me for months about my work truck parked in the driveway, about the shade of beige I painted the trim, about the height of my grass. But sending armed goons to my door, that was an escalation I hadn't calculated, a level of insanity that turned a property dispute into a hostage situation. Last warning. Miller, the lead guy, growled, putting a hand on my chest to shove me back. And that was his first mistake. His second mistake was assuming the house was empty behind me. I heard the distinct, rhythmic click of boot heels on the hardwood floor. Slow, deliberate, the sound of approaching doom. "Gentlemen," a voice cut through the morning air, sharp as a whip crack and cold as ice. "I suggest you take your hands off my husband before you commit a felony you can't plead down." Eleanor stepped into the light of the entryway, and I swear the temperature on that porch dropped 10 degrees. She wasn't in her pajamas. She wasn't half asleep. She was fully dressed for her shift. Gray uniform pressed crisp enough to cut skin, the silver bars of a state police captain gleaming on her collar, her badge catching the sun like a shield, and her hand resting casually, confidently on her service weapon. She didn't look scared. She looked bored, which is infinitely more terrifying if you know Eleanor. The four men in tactical cosplay froze, their brains stalling out as they tried to reconcile the housewife they were sent to intimidate, with the high-ranking officer standing 3 feet away. The lead guy's hand hovered near his gun, his mouth opening and closing like a fish on a dock. We have an order," he stammered, his gravel voice suddenly sounding very squeaky. For Mrs. Miller." "It's Captain Miller," she corrected, her eyes scanning their uniforms, picking apart every violation, every flaw. "And you're carrying firearms on private property, impersonating law enforcement." and attempting to detain a sworn officer of the law. I'm curious. Did you skip the day they taught survival instincts at Rent-A-Cop school? Or are you just suicidal? The lead guy tried to salvage his pride, puffing his chest out again, though it looked a lot more fragile this time. We are authorized agents of the Pine Creek HOA, enforcing Article 9. Section C regarding non-compliant residents. We have the authority to detain. You have the authority to remain silent, Eleanor said, reaching up to her shoulder. Mick, her eyes never leaving his face. Dispatch, this is Unit Alpha 19. I have for armed subjects at my residence attempting an unlawful entry and kidnapping. Send units roll, everyone. Copy that. Alpha 19 units are rolling. ETA 2 minutes. The radio crackled back, loud enough for the whole street to hear. And that was the moment the color drained out of their faces. It was like watching a dam break. The realization hitting them that they weren't the predators here. They were the prey. The guy in the back took a half step toward the driveway, his eyes darting to their unmarked van. But Eleanor just smiled, a shark-like grin that didn't reach her eyes. Don't run, she whispered. You'll just go to jail tired. But the arrogance of stupid men is a powerful thing. And the lead guy, maybe terrified of facing his boss or maybe just too dumb to quit, made a choice. He lunged, reaching for the handcuffs on his belt. Shouting, "You're coming with us," the board said. He never finished the sentence. I watched, almost in slow motion, as my wife, 5'7" of pure kinetic energy, sidestepped his clumsy grab, grabbed his wrist, and used his own momentum to spin him around and slam him face first into the brick siding of our house. It was a beautiful, brutal thud, the sound of air leaving lungs. And before his buddies could even blink, she had his arm torqued behind his back and him pinned against the wall. "Drop the weapons!" she roared, her voice command tone kicking in, the kind that makes your knees weak. "Face down on the concrete, hands behind your heads. Do it now, or I will drop you where you stand." The other three hesitated, looking at their leader groaning against the bricks, looking at Eleanor's hand on her weapon, looking at me, a big guy who was now holding a baseball bat I kept behind the door, and then, faintly at first but growing louder by the second, the sound of sirens began to bleed into the air. Not one siren, a symphony of them, a wailing wall of sound coming from the highway, coming from the precinct, coming to turn our quiet cul-de-sac into a war zone. They dropped their guns. Clatter, 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 cheap metal hitting the pavement. They got on their knees, hands laced behind their heads, looking like schoolboys caught smoking, stripped of all that fake bravado. But just as the first state trooper cruiser screeched around the corner, jumping the curb and tearing up Mrs. Higgins' prize petunias, a golf cart came buzzing down the street, electric, silent, and ridiculous. Out stepped Roger Sterling, the HOA president, clutching his clipboard like a shield, wearing a polo shirt to sizes too small and a look of absolute, furious entitlement. He didn't see the cruisers yet. He only saw his hired goons on their knees. "What is the meaning of this?" Roger shrieked, marching up the driveway, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. "Why aren't they in the van? I gave you specific instructions to remove the non-compliant residents before the morning commute." Eleanor looked up from where she was cuffing the lead guy, and the look she gave Roger could have peeled paint off a battleship. "Roger," she said, her voice deceptively calm, "you might want to turn around." "I will do no such thing," Roger spat, waving his clipboard at me. "You think you can ignore the fines? You think you can paint your trimmed dessert sand when the approved color is Camelot beige? The bylaws are clear. These officers are here to enforce the community standards you signed up for." "They aren't officers, Roger," I said, stepping off the porch, feeling the adrenaline finally start to shake my hands. "They're kidnappers, and you just admitted to hiring them. They are compliance specialists," Roger yelled, just as 3 more cruisers slammed to a halt, boxing in his golf cart. Doors flew open, shotguns racked, and a dozen real troopers poured out, creating a sea of grey uniforms and grim faces. Roger stopped. He looked left. He looked right. He looked at the real guns, then at his fake cops on the ground. And for the first time in the 5 years I've known him, Roger Sterling was speechless. But here's the thing about guys like Roger: they believe their own lies. They believe a contract with a homeowner is more powerful than the Constitution. He straightened his polo, looked at the troopers, and actually pointed his finger at the sergeant approaching him. "Officer, excellent timing. I need you to assist these men in removing Mrs. Miller. She has violated multiple covenants regarding commercial vehicle storage," and the sergeant, a guy named Davis who had been to our BBs, didn't even slow down. He walked right past Roger, kicked the fake gun away from the kneeling suspect and looked at Eleanor. "You good, Cap?" "I'm good, Davis," Eleanor said, hauling the lead guy up by his collar. "But Mr. Sterling here seems to be confessing to conspiracy, solicitation of kidnapping, and impersonating a police official. You might want to get that on body cam." Roger's eyes bulged. "Kidnapping? Don't be absurd. It's a civil enforcement action. I have the paperwork right here." He started fumbling with his clipboard, pulling out a sheet of paper that looked suspiciously like a warrant, complete with a gold seal that looked like it came from a sticker book. Eleanor handed her prisoner off to a deputy and walked down the steps, towering over Roger even though he was standing on his toes. She snatched the paper from his hand. "Let's see," she read aloud, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Order of detainment and asset seizure, authorized by the Pine Creek Board of Directors. Signed, Roger Sterling, President." "Roger, did you type this up in Word? Did you Google arrest warrant template?" The neighbors were all out now, phones raised, recording everything. The shame was starting to set in for Roger, the realization that he wasn't the king of the castle, just a sad little man in a golf cart. It's binding arbitration," he squeaked. "It's a felony," Eleanor said, leaning in close. "You hired mercenaries to attack a police captain because you didn't like the color of my house paint. Davis, cuff him." When the handcuffs clicked onto Roger Sterling's wrists, a sound rippled through the gathered crowd on the sidewalk. It wasn't a gasp. It was a cheer. A raw, spontaneous cheer from the people he had bullied for years. I saw old man Jenkins, who Roger had fined for having a bird feeder that was too whimsical, actually pumping his fist in the air. But as they marched Roger toward the cruiser, him kicking and screaming about bylaws and fiduciary duty, I caught a look on the face of the lead guy, the fake cop, that stopped me cold. He wasn't looking at Roger. He wasn't looking at the cops. He was looking at me. He was smiling. A cold, tight little smile that said, "You think this is over?" They hauled them all away, a parade of flashing lights leaving our quiet street, and for a few hours it felt like a victory party. Neighbors brought over donuts, people shook my hand like I'd just won the Super Bowl, and Eleanor was on the phone in the kitchen, debriefing the colonel. But when the adrenaline faded and the sun started to dip low, casting long shadows across the Camelot beige siding, the reality of what we found in that van started to come out. Eleanor came out to the back porch where I was nursing a beer, and she looked tired, not physical tired, but soul tired. She dropped a file folder on the table between us. It wasn't police evidence. It was copies of what they found in Roger's compliance files. "It wasn't just us, Jack," she said quietly, staring at the bubbles in her sparkling water. "Look at the invoices." I opened the folder. The company was called Guardian Solutions, based out of a shell address in Delaware. The invoices weren't just for security. They were itemized intimidation package A, asset seizure assistance, forced relocation services, and the totals. Roger had paid them $50,000 of the neighborhood's reserve funds. But the scary part was the client list. It wasn't just Pine Creek. It was Oak Ridge in Texas, Willow Run in Florida, the Summit in Virginia. "This is a franchise," I whispered, the beer suddenly tasting sour in my mouth. "They're franchising. Bullies." "It's worse," Eleanor said, tapping a document at the bottom. "Look who the parent company is. Sentinel Holdings. They're a subsidiary of a private prison contractor. Jack, they're testing the waters. They're trying to see if they can privatize local law enforcement by bypassing the city and going straight to the HOA letters. It's a loophole. If you sign the HOA covenant, you technically consent to their security measures." Roger wasn't just a crazy neighbor. He was a beta tester. That night, the news broke. The video of Eleanor slamming the guy into the brick wall went viral, millions of views in hours. Most people cheered, calling her a hero, the sheriff who fought back. But the comments, man, the comments were a different story. For every person praising her, there was someone else saying, well, if you signed the contract, you have to follow the rules or police can't be everywhere. Maybe private security is the future. It chilled me to the bone. The legal battle that followed was a nightmare. Roger flipped immediately, crying in his deposition that he was manipulated by the sales reps from Guardian Solutions. He claimed they promised him they had full legal authority, that they were off-duty officers, which turned out to be a lie. Most of them were dishonorably discharged or bounce-outs from security training. Roger got 5 years for conspiracy and fraud, mostly because he used HOA funds to pay for the hit. The compliance specialists got hit with impersonation and assault charges. And here's the kick of the company, Guardian Solutions. They walked away. Their lawyers, suits that cost more than my house, argued that they were merely consultants and that Roger had misinterpreted the scope of their services. They paid a fine, dissolved the LLC, and probably reopened the next day under a new name. But the moment that really sticks with me, the one I replay when I can't sleep, happened about 6 months later. We were at the grocery store, just normal life again. I was pushing the cart. Eleanor was checking the expiration date on milk. I saw a guy in the next aisle, clean cut, polo shirt, clipboard, talking to the store manager. He looked familiar. Not Roger familiar, but type familiar. He had that same arrogant stance, that same I'm the authority here vibe. He caught me looking. He didn't look away. He just nodded a slow, knowing nod and tapped his clipboard before walking off. I asked Eleanor later if she thought we really won. She looked at me, polishing her badge, the real badge, the one that stands for protecting people. Not property values, she said. We won the fight, Jack. But the war? The war is just realizing that there are people out there who would rather pay a mercenary to evict their neighbor than just knock on the door and talk to them. As long as people value control over community, there's always going to be a Roger Sterling, and there's always going to be a company ready to take his check. We moved out of Pine Creek a year later, bought a place with no HOA, out in the county, where the only thing I have to comply with is the sunrise and the property line. But sometimes when I drive through those manicured subdivisions, with their perfect grass and their identical mailboxes, I don't see peace anymore. I see a battlefield waiting for a spark. I wonder how many of you living in those places right now have read the fine print. On your latest community update, how many of you know exactly who shows up when you dial the security patrol number listed on the newsletter? Because let me tell you, when the men in black show up at your door at 6 a.m., you better hope you're married to the real police, or you better hope your neighbors are brave enough to come outside. What do you guys think? Was Roger just a lone nut job? Or are we looking at a future where the guy with the most money gets to make the laws? Drop a comment below. I read all of them, especially the ones from HOA presidents. Stay safe out there and keep your doors locked.